Dead Art Studios, Paint and Chat. And today we're going to talk about some artists who, unfortunately, they died during the 1918 flu pandemic. And we're going to do that while I'm working on my painting that I started last week, which is 40 by 30 centimetres on a birch panel. And I'm using hairs to make marks with black paint onto this sort of white and grey background that's sort of meant to represent a sort of foggy sort of scene outside. And I did sort of start this last week, and I experimented with making the marks with the hair. I quite liked it, and I got some different ideas and ways to use the hair. But then ultimately what I did was I wiped back the panel and used a bit of tissue to sort of create some texture in the grey, so that we can sort of have another go at it this week and try and do a little bit more structure and thought to the actual piece, rather than me just sort of randomly throwing down bits of hair in, hoping for the best. So we're going to take it pretty slow. And while we're doing that, we're going to talk about some artists who unfortunately died during the 1918 flu pandemic. And the reason I'm talking about that is because of one of the artists I was sort of researching to talk about on Paint and Chat, and that was Gustav Klimt. And he did ultimately die during the flu pandemic. He did have a stroke before and was left quite ill, but he was sort of hoping to make some kind of recovery, I think. But then unfortunately he got what was called the Spanish flu, and died at 55, which is really quite young. He probably would have done a lot more amazing work as well if he hadn't been ill so early, so it is a shame. And but when I was sort of researching this, I thought, well, did any other famous artists or artists in general die during that period? And they did. So I'll sort of run through those while I'm doing the painting. And then what we might do over the next few weeks is discuss some of them in more detail, because a couple of them I'm very sort of interested in and didn't know about. One or two I did. And I think it could be quite interesting to sort of just look at them in more detail. But today we'll just have a sort of overview of who they are and what I know about them, which in some cases is basically nothing. So let's get hair, start making some marks on this panel first, and then we can start discussing the topic, the chat. So what I'm doing is I'm putting black paint onto this plastic palette knife. That's one thing I discovered seemed to be helpful. And then what I can do is just drag the hair through the paint like that. This is quite a curly hair, this one. And then what I'm going to start on the sort of foreground down here. Just make tiny, gentle marks. Now last week when I sort of made some sort of more sort of blurry, not defined marks, I didn't like that so much. So I want to try and be quite precise. I'm going to try and find a hair that's not as curly. There we go. So so I started looking at artists who died during the flu pandemic, and I just went on Wikipedia, and there is, of course, as with most things, a topic on this of just notable people who died during the flu pandemic. I had a sort of Sunday morning just reading away at that. It was quite interesting. Let's make another line. And the first person that was noted, I've got a list over here, so I'll refer to it. First person was called Dudley John Beaumont. Now, Dudley John Beaumont, as far as I can make out, was a military man, a military officer, but also did some painting. Now, the interesting thing is, I can't actually find any of his paintings, but I did get sort of distracted with some of the other artists and didn't look into it that deeply. So I might have a look at Dudley himself in a bit more detail and see if it's worth looking at his paintings. And we might come back to him. But that was the first person who didn't make it through the flu pandemic. And it was called the Spanish flu. And the reason I discovered for that was because it was sort of like the end of World War I. Most countries sort of suppressed and censored to keep up morale around the world about the Spanish flu taking place. So they were like trying to keep their population sort of, I don't know, on high morale for the war and everything. And they didn't want to mention that there was this flu pandemic. But what they did report is they reported it in Spain, where they were having a sort of kind of revolution themselves and a lot of problems. And so the rest of the world sort of said, oh, there's this flu pandemic and it's in Spain. So it got known as the Spanish flu, but it was all over the world. It killed millions and millions and millions of people. So, yeah, sort of artists, writers, all sorts of folks, and obviously ordinary day-to-day folks that never made it into Wikipedia. So the next person is Amadeo de Souza Cardos. Now, I think he was Portuguese, and he did do some quite interesting sort of modern and almost bordering on the Cubist style paintings, and it's definitely, I think, worth having a look at him in some more detail at some point. Now, that one, I just pulled the hair a little bit and it just started to smudge across, and I'm not unhappy with that, but I do want to avoid that. So with the painting, I think what I'm trying to do is just create a sort of foreground pushing back towards a horizon here. To try and get a bit of perspective. So I'm just working on sort of foreground with a vague idea of it running in towards the centre of the panel. So I might do this side, sort of mirror that one as well. There we go. It's working quite nicely. I do like the mark it makes. And I think we can acquire some precision as we go. So after that, in the Wikipedia article was somebody called Carrie Cornplanter. She was a Native American or of Native American descent. And it's very interesting because she only has one painting in a museum, and it's a sort of, I think it's some people, some Native Americans crushing corn. And it's quite interesting because the painting, it almost, I think she was a child when she did it, and it looks like a child has done it. And it's the only one that was handed over to the museum. Her father was a diplomat, sort of Dutch and Native American diplomat. And I'm just wondering if, in some kind of diplomatic favour, one of his daughter's paintings was accepted by this museum, you see, or seen as like some kind of historical thing to keep, and that was a point of access for the museum because of their sort of the diplomatic father of Carrie Cornplanter, and she hasn't got any other artwork on there, and I think from what I can read, basically nothing else is known about her, which is a shame because it would have been very interesting to learn about Carrie. But unfortunately, I think she was relatively young, and she also didn't make it through the flu pandemic. I'm just laying the hairs down. Nice. We're getting the bins collected outside, so there's all sorts of racket going off. All right. So next person on my list, Harold Gilman. Now this is a British painter, impressionist, did portraits and interiors. Kind of got a, well, I say impressionist, but he had a kind of Van Gogh-like style and a kind of impressionist style as well, like, you know, a Monet type style, the way he sort of laid the brush marks. And I think there are some similarities in the way the brush marks were made between Van Gogh, however, I unfortunately can't say it properly. Yeah, I think there were some similarities in how they both laid the brush, and Harold also. So it'd be interesting to see where he fits into all that movement and time, and was he sort of a trendsetter, or was he following the trends and sort of just making a living as a painter rather than maybe creating artistic movements or whatever. I don't know, I'd have to look more. But his paintings certainly seem very nice. I did like them, and so we might have a look at him more, because I never heard of him until I've read this article. And, you know, it's a bit of a macabre topic, but from reading about it, I've learnt lots of interesting things, and I thought I'd pass them on to you. Maybe you can look them up yourselves, and it leads you down like crazy rabbit holes, doesn't it, going on Wikipedia, because you start clicking all the hyperlinks, and before you know it, you're checking out all sorts of things. Right, let's pause. I'm reasonably happy with how that's going. So I'll keep going, I think. I think it's going to be a matter of making a lot of these marks. That's too much paint. So next, we have got on the list Gustav Klimt himself. And Gustav is probably my favourite painter, I think. It just blows me away. He was trained in the academic style, and if you go and see his works at like the Belvedere in Vienna and stuff, you'll just see how amazing his sort of academic style paintings were. They're the best I've seen, you know, portraits, buildings, things like that. And following the death of his brother, who was also a painter, he totally changed style and started doing far more sort of symbolism, expressionism, and really, I would say Gustav Klimtism. You know, he's one of the few artists that really did have his own style. He used sort of like Japanese styles as well as like very flat perspectives, two-dimensional, you know, with sort of decorative patterns around semi-nudes and lovers entwined and things like that. He did the odd landscape as well, like it's one of the Kimsey where he used to go on holiday every summer. It's particularly nice, but of course he's famous for The Kiss and the others done around that time, and I do just think he was an outstanding artist. So we'll definitely have a full deep dive into Gustav and his life one week, and yeah, we'll learn a bit more about him if you don't know anything about him, or if you know a bit about him, you know, you can listen to me, see what I think I know about him. And when I saw his paintings, when I saw The Kiss, that was the one painting that did actually make me like take my sort of breath away when I saw it. It was far more impressive than you see on the museum postcards and stuff that you can buy. There we go. That's the hair marks going on quite nicely now, aren't they? So yeah, poor Gustav. He had a stroke and then unfortunately got pneumonia from suspected flu. So very sad, because he was 55 years old, and he definitely would have had some more artwork to contribute. So next on the list is somebody very interesting to me, Ruby Lindsay. Or she went under lots of names, Ruby Linds, and all sorts of different little pseudonyms, because she wanted to hide the fact that she was female. And she was a cartoonist and sketch artist from Australia. She was married to the famous political cartoonist, was it Dyson Freeman? I don't know, somebody Dyson. Who was also, he did sort of war-based cartoons and political cartoons and things like that. And she was a serious artist in her own right, totally independent, made every effort to stay independent, and yeah, very interesting to me. Amazing sketches as well. So we'll definitely have a look at Ruby Lindsay one week and have a proper deep dive into her artwork. There we go. She moved to London after sort of growing up in Australia. And, you know, there was those political magazines, wasn't there, like Punch and stuff, and I think cartoon was actually seen as a more important sort of political medium than it is now. I mean, it was even when I was a kid with the little cartoons in the newspaper and such, but it seems to have been even more important back then. I'm getting in a tangle with my hair now. I've got a gloopy bit sort of stuck at the top, and I don't want to get that onto the board. I do like the way that the marks are made. They're sort of very specific and precise, but also I've got this freedom to them. So, you know, when I told my family that I was doing this with human hair out of the hairbrush, their response was, "Ew," and I suppose that is valid. But I'm going to go with it. I don't want to seem like a psychopath. And I'm not. But it's just interesting to me, the marks that these hairs are making. So we'll just keep doing it. This one I think I'm going to have to discard and get another one. All right. So who's next on my list? So we've had Ruby Lindsay. Next we've got Niko Pirosmani, a naive painter. It says naive. So, and I did actually have a look at his artwork. Did find it to be quite interesting. Don't know a lot about that painter at all, so we may well have a look at their work at some point in the future as well. Get a bit more paint up here. All right, pull it through. So next on the list is Morton Schamberg, a modernist painter from America. Yeah, modernist. Seems to have some interesting works. It's interesting, isn't it, how certain artists get sort of like held above the others for certain movements and times, and you assume that those artists were the ones that, you know, developed it and invented it. It might actually be more of a case of it being a much more generalised movement, and those being the artists that shouted loudest or, you know, made as much of a sort of celebrity impact as anything else. So I haven't heard of Morton Schamberg, but that could be my ignorance more than anything. So we will look at Morton and see what he's been doing one week before he met his end in a sad way. I suppose meeting your end in virtually anyway is quite sad. Now that's the first one where I dragged it and it made a little, I mean, it could be something in the wind, couldn't it? Movement, but I'm trying to avoid it. So after Morton, we have the last person on the list of people who passed away, who were artists during the 1918 flu pandemic. That is the understudy and protege of Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele. Now, if you ever fancy a read about someone who had a questionable life, then Egon might well be a person to read about. He definitely had what we can call a colourful and troubled upbringing. And he sort of carried that on, really, with he was thrown out of several sort of towns and villages and put in prison for making art that was deemed pornographic, basically. But I have seen a lot of his work in person, because when I went to Vienna, there was an exhibition on all his work, because he is from Austria, like Gustav, and Gustav offered to mentor him when he sort of left various academies and such. And you can see why. Some of his artwork is amazing. Just his style and the way he draws, it is just very unique, and it is very skillful, and it is very emotive, and it is beautiful. But he definitely was like, yeah, in various amounts of trouble for various things. We can discuss Egon's life. It was short, bless him, because he was much younger than Gustav and died of the Spanish flu. Just a few days after his, I think it was his wife or his lover. He had a wife and a lover, so you know we can see that things were complicated. And yeah, he travelled around Austria and also and then into what I call the Czech Republic, but it's not anymore, is it? At that time it was Bohemia. So, yeah, and there is a museum in Český Krumlov dedicated to him. And like I say, I saw a lot of his work when I was in Vienna. And he did a lot of sort of semi-nudes, nudes, and self-portraits, did do some buildings, did a little bit of landscape work, but he was definitely interested in himself, interested in people, interested in sex, interested in colour, I would say. I don't know. You can read about him and sort of make your decisions on what you think he was like as a person, but some of his artwork, I see it and I just think it's absolutely brilliant. Even if he did have a pretty shady life, I think I can. And you know, I weren't really there either, was I? Nobody was there. It's just from what you're reading. You don't really know the ins and outs of it. So all I can really judge him on is the artwork he left behind. And some of it's great. Some of it's a bit like self-absorbed, and some of it's a bit weird and slightly scary. But some of it's really great. Yeah. So that is according to Wikipedia. All the artists who died during the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, just to brighten things up, it does have notable survivors as well on the article, but I thought, well, surely that's like everybody who didn't die, really. Like, if you were notable and you didn't die, then you survived. But I suppose what they're saying is people who are known to have caught the flu probably got quite poorly, and then made it through. And there's only 2 artists listed for that, and the first one is Edvard Munch. Is he Norwegian? I think he's Norwegian, isn't he? Please correct me if I'm wrong. Edvard Munch, he survived. Of course, most famous for the Scream. Or Screams, because I think there's several of them, which I didn't know, but there is. I know there is. He did more than one, which is interesting in itself. And the other is a firm school and academic favourite of artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, with her floral, maybe some people would say suggestively floral pictures, and Americana, really, I would say. Great American artist. You know, you get Jackson Pollock, you get Rothko, but surely Georgia O'Keeffe was just as important and relevant to early American art as it tried to find itself and stamp itself down over Paris. I think that's another reason Gustav never probably got the. I mean, he is super well known, isn't he? But like, if he'd lived in Paris, like, you know, like Picasso and Monet and stuff, would he have got even more recognition? Right, let's pause there with that. and have a look at the painting. So the background, we've sort of got where I've sort of used a piece of paper towel and just splodged away at the sort of wet paint and brought the grey out from underneath. It's got a sort of misty forest feel to it, and then I'm making these black marks at the front. Most good, a couple, I don't suppose I can control them though, can I? Because I'm going to make the odd error. It's going to have to be part of the painting. Am I happy? Reasonably happy. I'm going to carry on. Next week maybe we'll discuss one of the artists in more detail, maybe Gustav Klimt first, eh? And I thought maybe, would it be too much if I flashed up some of his artwork, or could we do a separate series? I've been threatening to do all sorts. Anyway, paint and chat, Dead Art Studios. See you next time.